Thank you so much for being back with us again. So I think what's important to talk about here in terms of where we start is that it has been an absolutely frightening year when it comes to climate disasters around the world. You think about what happened in June of last year with those devastating floods in Pakistan that left 2,000 people dead and also a third of the country underwater. You think about what's happening right now in Somalia, which is on the brink of a famine as I speak, and they're saying that the death toll could be far worse than what we saw in 2011. And even more recently in Malawi, where the same cyclone, Cyclone Freddy, hit Malawi, not just once, but twice, and it was one of the most intense cyclones on record. We all know that the most vulnerable communities in this world have contributed the least in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but they stand the most to lose in terms of climate change. We are not on track. We're not even anywhere close to being on track to reach the target of the Paris Agreement in terms of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we really need to accelerate the transition to green energy. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we also need to prioritize much more resilient infrastructure in the global south. So Nili, let me start with you. When it comes to climate solutions, what are the low and zero carbon technologies that you think will really drive opportunities for investors?
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. When you think about climate solutions as one of the major asset classes in financing the transition, we're basically talking about investments that drive the transition. So you have things that are already part of a green economy, like solar and wind. Climate solutions are the innovative technologies that help to solve the problem directly. And so for investors, we really want to understand what are the technologies that are ready for us in this field right now. At Carbon Direct Capital, we are investing in climate solutions specifically to manage carbon. And we're really excited about 5 key pillars where we're making growth equity investments today. So first of all, capturing carbon. When you think about industrial processes, you can capture carbon at the point of production and store it. Removing carbon from the atmosphere after it's been emitted is a huge piece of the pie that we have ahead of us. And then since we're going to be capturing and removing so much carbon, carbon utilization. I like to call it the circular economy of carbon, where we can use CO2 to displace other assets that have traditionally been produced using petrochemicals. And then, at the end of the day, in order to manage carbon, we need to scale up solutions like green hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel. And we're investing in technologies all across those pillars.
So Steve, you know a thing or two about what Nelly just said. So what is at stake, do you think, based on all the work that you do with Revoda? What is at stake if we don't resort to using and prioritizing carbon-reducing technologies first? That should be, according to you, a main priority.
Thank you. I think that we are right now, as a collective, at a very serious inflection point where we have to make the right decisions, right? We are going to make decisions, but they need to be the right decisions. And we, as a group of people, are stewards over this earth. And we have that responsibility on us to manage it appropriately. If we make the right decision, then we create a clean and prosperous future for our posterity. And if we make poor decisions, then we are going to put financial burdens, and we're going to hand over an earth that's not suitable for them. And so I think what we need at this transition right now is absolute clarity in thinking. What's going to happen if we don't address the carbon situation, and what are the tools that we need to bring to bear to adequately solve that problem? And there's a lot of money right now that's positioned to go after technologies that may or may not be able to solve that problem in an adequate way, as we see that we are behind on the Paris Agreement targets right now, and we need solutions that can go after the heart of the problem. And so I think that that a forum like this is very helpful in helping us get our minds around what's needed to make that right decision, to bring the right capital to bear against solutions that will be effective right now to set us on the right path while we allow some additional technologies to mature and come up and replace those other technologies that we're so used to working with.
So it's not just about thinking about the long term, you have to really prioritize what we can do in the short term. Rishi, what would you say was the role of banks in the transition to a zero carbon society, do you think?
Can I, well, first of all, let me thank the hosts and the panel. Of course, it's great to be here with all of you. But can I broaden the question, if you don't mind, a little bit? I'm going to say financial services firms rather than just limiting my response to what can banks do. And there's a selfish reason, because we are a financial investment manager, not just a bank. Actually, we are not a bank anymore. So I'm going to pick up from something that was referenced earlier. As we think about the pathway to 1.5 degrees, which is what most of us have realized is absolutely essential, and most of us have signed up to, I'm not going to say 100%, but consensus is there. That pathway is going to require us to have a three-pronged strategy, right? One built around adaptation, one built around transition, and one built around decarbonization. Decarbonization, which is probably the most impactful, that leads us to a net zero outcome by 2050, is not a switch that you can throw overnight. It is essential. We have to invest in the R&D. We have to scale up the underlying technologies, as Nili was referencing, but it's going to take some time. Adaptation is needed today because of what is happening in Malawi, in Pakistan, in California, in Australia, in parts of where I come from, in India, and so on, right? And the transition is really what I think has started and gained speed the most, momentum the most, in terms of transitioning, particularly the power generation sector, from fossil fuels to renewables, increasingly solar, wind, hydro, nuclear, and so on. The role that we, as investors, as stewards of capital, if I can call it that, have to play in that is on all three fronts. Number one, the risk and return profile of those three is radically different from each other. The decarbonization journey is a little bit more venture growth stage. The transition journey is much more infrastructure-like, and the adaptation journey is mature infrastructure, right? Basically building resilience into the existing infrastructural assets within these vulnerable at-risk communities that are at risk of flooding, forest fires, et cetera, such that we can, in fact, provide them with the air cover that they need before we get up to that 2030, 2040, 2050, net zero economy. And, I'm proud to say that InvestCorp is active on all three of those fronts. We look at infrastructure as probably one of the most attractive secular long-term asset classes in terms of yield in the long run for investors. But even more than that, one of the most interesting investment theses presenting itself to us as long-term private equity investors today is the decarbonization journey. Not every sector within decarbonization, but certainly mobility, agriculture, carbon management, and the built environment, the offices and the homes that we stay in. Fantastic opportunity to deploy capital.
And Samir, banks, as we were just discussing, obviously wield so much power. What is the right way for banks to wield that power? I mean, given your role at HSBC.
Well, first of all, we all recognize that the target is to get at in 2050 on a net zero, and I think that science is telling us that there will be many new technologies that will happen. No one knows what and when. There will be a lot of companies investing in capturing and in compensations, but the numbers are compelling, but we don't know how much it will be compelling. And then we know for fact now, science-based, that we need to reduce carbon between now and then, in the meantime of doing all the other efforts, and we need to plan it from now. So the bank's role is to make sure that a credible transition to 2050 net zero is happening across the globe, and this credible transition will be financed by banks. So clearly, we've agreed, all the major banks, and agreed with all the public sectors and all the regulators, that we will continue to finance, every single activities that is working seriously toward getting net zero in 2050. So the role of banks is to continue to finance every and all the companies that are getting into this journey. And in the case of HSBC, for example, we've committed our own net zero will be in 2030, but the portfolio of lending that we have to be net zero in 2050. And it is a portfolio of lending, and it's work that we will have to do with each sector to get there. So the role of bank is to continue finance these companies that are willing to work with us on this journey.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit later on about HSBC's role and work in particular. But Rishi, what sort of responsibility does the global north? I was talking about, you brought up, some of the climate disasters we've seen in the global north, but I was talking in the introduction about what we've seen in the global south. What sort of responsibility does the global north have right now in terms of financing the global south transition towards green energy?
I think it's a responsibility that goes hand in hand with the obligation that we have upon us, as a race, to do what needs to be done to protect planet Earth. It's almost as simple as that. This is not a choice. This is not a, let's see what the alternative is. There is no other alternative. The real question is, can you deploy that capital that is necessary to build that resilience inside the global south to allow them to transition in a meaningful way that is not going to stunt their economic growth in a manner that also generates the appropriate expected return on that investment, right? And that is really, I think a lot of the narrative today is coming at it from the perspective of, it's a challenge and who's going to do it and who wants to do it and so on. Well, yeah, maybe it is a challenge and so on, but it's equally an opportunity, right? And the opportunity part of it is really what gets us fairly excited, because there are, on all three dimensions, whether it's adaptation, transition, or decarbonization, each of those three offer a very attractive opportunity for investment of capital with attractive risk-adjusted returns, right? And I outlined some of the areas earlier, but we are certainly more than happy to put our money where our mouth is. Now, we know that the decarbonization part in particular, where there is going to be the necessity for deployment of new technologies and then scaling up those new technologies. So it's the R&D, the proof of concept, and the commercial scaling up. That is likely to happen in the north, right? Because that's where the current competence sits. But the deployment of those technologies at scale is going to happen in the global south. And that's where the opportunity is, right? So there is a way to navigate or thread this needle, which is not looking at it from the point of view of a challenge, but from the vantage point of it being a very interesting opportunity for generating long-term attractive returns. And yeah, we are fully behind that.
Nili, there have been so many promises that haven't been kept when it comes to green energy transition. And so as we think about how we finance the transition, we also have to think about how we do it in a way that ensures accountability, transparency, and in a way that is measurable as well.
Yes. When it comes to financing the transition, one point that has been made that I think is really important to appreciate is that the finance sector's transition is the real economy's transition. Every single other sector, every single company, our clients, our value chain, our work is to support their transition. And so when you think about measurement, pathways, and accountability, the work now becomes deeper, where we look at how finance supports individual sector transitions, and then also looking at the fact that different countries' transitions will be different, different regions' transitions will be different, and how do we support that in a more nuanced way. At Carbon Direct, I mentioned we have Carbon Direct Capital. We also have Carbon Direct Inc., which is our client-facing advisory business, where we work with clients a lot on measurement, building into action and accountability. And we really see that there are 5 key steps that every institution, financial and otherwise, need to take in how they manage this. The first one is education and understanding. In order for institutions to move forward, they need to feel comfortable with their pathways. Leaders want to commit to something they understand. And then they need to provide education to their stakeholders on what they need to do. The second is footprinting. It's really taking a look at what the data is today and building a pathway to where it needs to go. The third thing is reporting so that you have transparency inside of your institution and to the global economy about your role in the transition. And then last, actions. Strategies then to manage reductions against that starting point, and then to remove the rest.
Steve, let me bring you back in. I think we have time for one more question. Obviously you're heavily focused with your company on carbon removal technology. We know that hydrocarbons still account for 80%, pretty much 80% of the world's energy needs right now. And there are those who say, look, we know that the transition to green energy, green technology is obviously going to take a lot of time, but we should not be perpetuating the use of hydrocarbons in the meantime. What do you say to those people?
I love that question because we need to bifurcate an issue here. Hydrocarbons and fossil fuels are not bad. The CO2 and the pollution out of those fuels are bad. There are solutions that target and fix those problems. Our technology removes the CO2 not after the process, during the process of combustion. Meaning that if we put our technology in to gasoline, diesel, coal, or other technologies, that you're not going to have CO2 as an output. In place of CO2, you have oxygen. That means that we can take the bad side of the fossil fuels away, and we can enjoy the immense benefits of that dense energy resource. There's a reason why we use, as 80% of our energy requirements, hydrocarbon fuels. It's energy dense. There's logistics footprint to get it to the entire world, including the most vulnerable populations. And we need that resource right now. Samir alluded to that fact that may take time, and we need solutions right now that'll put a massive dent into carbon emissions. This technology, and I know there's other technologies out there, but I'm very familiar with what we do.
Of course.
We could remove 15 gigatons per annum. That's 15 gigatons per year. And if this technology rolled out to the entire world through the full fuel supply, coal, oil, natural gas, that would put us 20 years ahead of that 1.5 degree target. And so we don't want to go after that incredibly rich resource that is benefiting the entirety of humanity. We want to go after the problem that's incident to that resource, and that's what we're targeting.
We have, I think, time for one last question. I'm going to pose it to you, Samir. Obviously, Stephen is given his role at Revoto, is heavily focused on carbon removal technology, but the transition towards green energy still needs to be financed. Obviously, the return on investment can be shaky. Who do you think is responsible for assuming the risk?
Well, I think that when you think about the numbers that are required to be invested, you would think that the private equity sector would be able to take part of it, but the real big topic would be the public sector, the public sector involvement in it. And I think about the World Bank, I think about the IMF, I think about all the regional banks that will have to take the first loss. And I think that PIF is giving us a great example of what is happening through the first loss, basically through the equity investment that they are doing in the green hydrogen in NEOM, for example, where banks are coming to finance, but the first loss is taken by a sovereign wealth fund or a public bank. And when you think about the reform that is happening or will happen at the World Bank, the essence of this reform is to make sure that the World Bank is deploying more toward the energy transition and taking more of the primary risk, to support financing of this energy transition. So my view is that definitely 60, 70, 75% of the risk of the equity should come from the public sector. And some may look at me and say, yes, you bankers, you'll always say that the first loss is not for us, but the reality is that we are all in this journey together and everyone is in his role. And I really have a call to public money to come and be the first loss of this transition.
Right, because we are all in together. All right, Rishi, Samir, Nili, Steve, thank you so much. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists, please? Thank you.